2002 metais buvo įkurtas Baltų centras. Ir šio seminaro organizatoriai esame mes, mokslo grupė Kalbos, literatūros, kultūros ir istorijos tyrimai regioninis aspektas. Tai mūsų atveju regionas būtų Lietuva ir Latvija. O kitas dalykas, visos 3 mokslo grupės darbuotojos mes esame asociacijos Baltų centros narės. Tai visi dalykai susiveda į Lietuvą ir Latviją. O dabar jau suteikiu tada žodį Inai.
Thank you very much for this invitation to celebrate both the anniversary of the Republic of Latvia and 20th anniversary of the Baltic Center at the Šiaulių Academy of the University of Vilniaus. We have a very close cooperation with Regionų, with Baltic Center, and I'm glad that I have the honor to inform about activities in my research project, informing you about research on language situation in Latvia. What I'm going to speak about. First of all, I'll describe my own field of studies. It's language policy as a subfield of sociolinguistics. Then I'll tell you something about language situation in Latvia, which is quite different and at the same time similar to the language situation in Lithuania. Then to provide some information about our research done by the Latvian Language Agency and about our research program, the Latvian language, which is already over, and Letonica, which is going on right now. How to evaluate the success of language policy? We use the traditional approach. We are analyzing 3 main indicators: language skills, language use, and language attitudes. And within our project, we pay attention to language attitudes because we are convinced that attitudes is the main factor establishing background for language learning, language teaching, and language use too. And at the very end of my presentation, I'll give you some idea of current processes going on in Latvia, which are quite interesting from the theoretical point of view. Maybe some critical incident analysis, maybe some impact of political processes to language attitudes, and at the very end, maybe some ideas for comparative research in Latvia and Lithuania. Shortly, where we can locate research on language policy. Sociolinguistics, despite of having big impact from sociology, ethnology, psychology, political science, and so is still considered a part of linguistics. And sociolinguistics, in its part concerning macro processes, has to do with language policy. And here you also see this triangle: language skills, language use, and language attitudes. As for definitions of language policy, the first meaning of this term is part of domestic policy. How to decide about the roles of particular languages in society. So it's part of domestic policies. In some countries it's even very important part. It has close ties with education policies, cultural policies, and in Latvia, this understanding of language policy is very closely merged with another definition: language policy as research discipline. Because theoretically, if we want to establish sustainable language policy for our countries, they must have enough theoretical background. And therefore, it's necessary to do comparative research, to study history of sociolinguistics, to be very well aware about language situation in a given country in order to provide some recommendations for language policy makers. And it also could be said that especially during first years after re-establishment of our independence, in Latvia people doing language policy as a branch of scholarship and involved in language policy as a part of domestic policies were the same. So I don't know another country, maybe in some extent Lithuania and Estonia, where scholars had been so closely involved in practical language policy, making legislation, providing information to society, and so on. Why I consider it necessary to speak about language policy as branch of science? Because it's a very sensitive area. We have to take into account language as symbol, language as element of national identity, but language is also the tool, the instrument. And this pragmatic and symbolic meaning of language sometimes make some controversy. And therefore, we have to be very careful in balancing these symbolic and pragmatic aspects. We must think about language sustainability. Language, I mean the Latvian language, the Lithuanian language, the Estonian language, and so on. These languages are part of global linguistic diversity. The respective countries are responsible for their maintenance, and therefore it's not only domestic national task to protect these languages from extinction, it's also contribution to the protection of global lingual diversity. There are no two countries with identical language situation and therefore with identical language policy, because language policy always depends on language situation and it's deeply grounded in historical, social, cultural, traditional and other circumstances. And therefore, I'm not going to provide a common recipe for achieving this sustainability, maintenance of language. It differs, but I suppose that our goal is to provide the best action model for language situation in Latvia in order to protect the Latvian language as our official state language and also the language of the titular ethnos. Here you see our goals. Goals for language policies usually are almost identical in all countries where we have one official state language. To ensure the sustainability, linguistic quality, it means standardization and codification of norms too, and also how to present our language among other languages in the world, in the region, and in our case, in the European Union. And of course, we have to guarantee the protection and maintenance of minority languages in our country. Later, I'll say some words about the Livonian language, our special treasure, because there are mutual ties concerning language attitudes towards our attitude for minority language and for the official state language in the sense of protection of language as such. And of course, who else than not we. So Latvia is the only country who can assume responsibility for protection of the Latvian language. Of course, we as Lithuanians have a huge diaspora. We try to protect and to develop language in diaspora situation too, but the basic pool of language speakers is in our country. Some words about parameters of language situation. We usually use this model in order to describe the situation where the Latvian language functions. First of all, type of the state matters, unitary or federal state. And if some people say that we have countries like Belgium, Canada, Switzerland as role models, you see there are several languages coexisting. We always have to remind such people that these are federal countries. Only one language is the main language in separate parts of a country, and multilingualism functions only at the federal level. But Latvia, as Lithuania, Estonia, France, and a lot of other countries are unitary countries. So the same principles for all the territory. Of course, our neighbor countries matter, especially when speaking about, let's say, border multilingualism, also development of minority education system, and so. And main factor is the ethno-demographic and linguistic structure of the population. Unfortunately, we have no questions about language skills during our last censuses, so we can rely only on polls, but anyway, we must have some idea about language skills, and this is one of the main factors in establishing, let's say, language policy in education, language policy in information, and so on. Language status in the country is also important. If language has a status of the official state language and the only official state language, it means some integrative functioning of this language in official domains. At the same time, of course, not restricting other language speakers' rights in the private field. Language use. Theoretically, in most of countries, principle, if I know language, I use it, functions, but this is not the case in Latvia. And it again has to do with language attitudes. As you'll see further, during last 30 years, Latvian has become the main language in official, formal domains, but in informal communication among neighbors, in public transport, in shops, and so on, we still may speak about some relicts of the previous period. Russian language still occupies functions incompatible with the status of minority language. And of course, again, language as value, language as symbol. During our last research, we analyzed what does it mean to have language as value? What does it mean, symbolic function of a language? Maybe it's simply tradition we inherited from classical literature or from folklore. Maybe it's only concept learned in school, but maybe it's something more. Maybe it has to do with national identity. And the answer is still not here. We still have to analyze why practical language behavior differs from theoretical declarations in almost all domains what had been clearly seen in surveys among Latvian-speaking population. And we are not alone in the world. We are not a lonely island. Therefore, global sociolinguistic processes, even fashionable trends, even some global crises had their impacts on language situation. So we had to find the coordination between language attitudes and external factors. You, of course, know basic facts about Latvia, therefore I'm not going to speak about this. What I can say, we have not only our language law, adopted in 1999, no amendments, no changes since then, but we have also official language policy guidelines. It's much more detailed document, including financial part, organization part, resource responsible for different aspects are involved, and the last issue of language policy guidelines had been adopted in 2021, very recently, and it's very, very detailed document. And we mustn't forget, Latvian is not so-called small language, as Lithuanian is not. There are only about less than 400 languages spoken by more than 1 million of people out of 7,000 world's languages. So it's very, very good result. So Latvian and Lithuanian is at least mid-sized, or not, if not big language. But it happens that we have two very big, or sometimes called killer languages in our language market, Russian and English, with high market value, with big numbers of speakers outside Latvia. And when we have these global communication systems, when we have possibilities to travel, when we have historical traditions and maybe some inherited minority complex again among Latvians, it matters. About ethnic situation, here you see the figures. Unfortunately, the total population is decreasing. Now we can't speak about 2 million inhabitants in Latvia. No, only about 1,900,000. You see that the proportions of Latvians is growing, but in absolute figures, the number of people is diminishing. We have, according to some calculations, even 400,000 Latvians abroad. You see that if we calculate all people in the world having Latvian language skills, so approximately 2.3 million. It's enough if we speak only about numbers, about possibilities to maintain the language. Economically, it's possible. Is it possible politically? Yes, but we mustn't forget two factors, that the Soviet time Russification hasn't been completely reversed yet, and the impact of English as a global language, of course, is growing too. So we are in between two very strong market forces, which makes our situation even more complex. And also, wrong understanding of minority rights. And therefore we have this researchers and politicians dilemma, how to promote Latvian language skills use and positive attitudes in the situation where we have full implementation of highest standards of minority language rights for Russian as self-sufficient language, and in the situation of huge immigration of Russian-speaking population and still functioning Russia's media environment. And we try to find an answer to this question for the last 30 years. Did we manage to do this? I suppose only partially. We are still working along that. Here again, some hints for language as a symbol. We, as all countries, have our constitution, satversme. There are very few countries including the concept of language in so-called preamble of the constitution. Lithuania has it, Estonia has it. In the European Union, only Spain and Hungary included linguistic issues in the preamble of the language, but in the preamble of the Constitution for Latvia, language has been mentioned for 3 times, so it's absolute record. How we try to research the language situation, you see that the first attempt had been even during the Soviet period. Then in the Soviet Union, such a big program development of national languages in the era of socialism had been carried on, and all so-called Soviet republics had to investigate the language situation with one, let's say, covert goal to demonstrate how the Russian language has become the second mother tongue. Remember, there was such a concept for all Soviet people. And indeed, quite correct sociolinguistic research had been done at the Institute of Language and Literature at that time, and also conclusion was quite interesting. So the Latvian language is functioning as the second component of social bilingualism against the background of universal Russian language skills. Revolutionary conclusion. But then the political environment changes. We regained our independence. The research stayed unpublished, but anyway, so now we have a material to compare the situation nowadays. And of course it has been improved, but not in such an extent we would like to see. Then in years 1995-96, our department at the Latvian Language Institute carried on quite a bulky sociolinguistic survey among Russian-speaking population in Latvia and Latvians themselves. The results were not surprising. Again, we had to recognize that functions of Russian language still didn't correspond to the status of minority language. But when the Latvian Language Agency, the main institution responsible for the development of the Latvian language, had been established, they carried on sociolinguistic survey language situation in Latvia, and you see 3 issues had been published, and I would say that we are very well aware what's going on, not only statistically but also psychologically, because these publications involve not only statistical quantitative part of language research, but also, I would say, philosophical part. And as concerns publications in language policy as a field of scholarship, we also already have a lot of books and collective monographs published. So besides these research language situation in Latvia, we have a collective monograph about Latvian language during 50 years of independence. We have a special monograph about the present law on the state language in Latvian and in English. And when we participated in the previous state research program, we published a collective monograph, Nacionālās identitātes sociolinguistic aspects of national identity. And now we are continuing that work. But today I'd like to present you the methodology and present results of our last state research program and to inform you about ongoing research and maybe to provide some ideas how we could compare the situation of two living Baltic languages. As I mentioned before, we have to do research in two parallel directions. One is monitoring of the dynamics of language situation, and colleagues from the Latvian language agencies doing this, and also to do qualitative studies of language ideologies, including public opinion about language issues, linguistic stereotypes, and we have a lot of them, also our attitude towards language standardization, and so on and so on. And results of our research are available on the web, both our monograph about the Latvian language attitudes, values, belief and practices, and the latest issue of sociolinguistic study language situation in Latvia, both in Latvian and English. Here you see how these publications look like. The English edition is identical visually, but of course all the data and all information has been translated into English. Our monograph about Latvian language attitudes includes quite big summary in English. But now about language skills, because this is very important factor in order to evaluate practical language policies, let's say in education or in information or in workplace and so on. And these are the latest figures from our survey. It's not census, it's survey, traditional sample, about 1,000 respondents. You see that among those whose native language is Russian, 94 people recognized Latvian language skills. We didn't ask about levels, so it's self-evaluation. Maybe it's only A1, but anyway. But if we speak about generation age group 1834, then 96%. And if we speak about other language groups, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Estonians, Lithuanians too, then these figures are, as you see, much more lower. High, but anyway lower. And again, then it's a question why? And again, it has to do with some ongoing processes of Russification, despite of efforts to eliminate this during last 30 years. And as concerns language use in sociolinguistic domains, of course, language in informal communication, family, friends, and so on is totally free. So our language law guarantees this. But let's say language with clients, business partners, in working discussions and so on, theoretically must be in the state language, but theoretically, not in practice. You see that in a lot of cases, Russian language also has been used, let's say, with clients and business partners, even in 66 percent of cases. It again proves the conclusion I have already told you, that there are no problems with Latvian in informal communication, but in informal communication there are still negative stereotypes about language use. But why it's so? And again, we come to language attitudes, because we have language skills, we have language law, we have quite clearly declared state of art. So Latvian is the language of society integration. But why? It hasn't been used in situations where it could be normal in other countries, let's say in Lithuania too. And again, we have to speak about language attitudes. Set of subjective factors, stereotypes, maybe inherited prejudices, maybe some learned concept or feeling of superiority among some language groups. We analyze all these factors, and conclusions are, let's say, not very promising. And it's impossible to speak about language attitudes not speaking about identity. We know that there are a lot of discussions among philosophers, sociologists. What does it mean, identity? Is it a fiction or reality? Can we have separate linguistic identity apart from, let's say, ethnic or national or gender or cultural identity? Our point of view is that there is linguistic identity. These are not researchers' biases. We have to study this, and we have to find its roots, and we have to find its coordination with another aspects of identity. How to understand language as value? If we treat values as important and lasting beliefs or ideals shared by members of a culture, then we have to ask questions: which kind of value language presents? Is it simply very valuable means of communication? And there is a tendency in global theory of sociolinguistics that language is only means of communication, and a lot of people during our surveys also say, so no matter which language we speak, it's important to communicate. Not answering the question, if it's no matter for you, then let's speak Latvian. Is language an economic asset? Yes, and we have enough proof for this. Have we to protect our language as a global cultural heritage? Almost everybody says yes. And is language a symbol of national and individual identity? Theoretically, yes, no doubt, but in practice, practical activity doesn't confirm the theoretical belief. Here you see one chapter from the Constitution of Latvia. So, Latvian and lived traditions, the Latvian language is the only official language, and there is another part where Latvian language has been mentioned too. So, very high level of theoretical recognition of the Latvian language, but in practice we still feel some consequences of previous language practices. And now I'll want to show you some case studies in order to demonstrate that language attitudes prevail in all the set of language use, language skills, and language as value. And two quite recent events demonstrates it quite clearly and gives a new task to sociolinguists to try to explain them and to position them in the complex of language policy activities. We all remember very well, we had COVID pandemics not so long time ago, but the peak of these events were on spring 2021. Then we all were subjected to vaccination campaigns were going on, and not surprisingly, they had to do with language in two senses. One is which wording to use to convince people who are not sure about necessity to be vaccinated, and the other sense, what does this pandemic situation teaches us about language attitudes in the society. What you see in this first slide, here you see the attitude among Latvian speakers and Russian speakers towards vaccination. So this yellow one shows the percent of Latvians vaccinated or going to be vaccinated, and this one is Russian speakers. And you see not very big, but difference between these two groups. And there was an uproar in the society. Why Ministry of Healthcare, why the State Language Center doesn't insist on providing more information in Russian? So we are, I'm speaking very primitively, ready to kill people because of our principles in language policy and so on. And the Latvian population divided themselves into groups. One group was insisting that go to hell with your language policy, you have to save people and therefore use bilingual information everywhere. The other group said, okay, we understand the situation is extraordinary, we provide information in Russian in mass media, but there is no necessity to put big posters everywhere with bilingual communication, to communicate bilingually in shops, in trams, and so on. It's enough to have communication in the state language. In reality, the communication was trilingual, Latvian, Russian, and English. And we did research in social networks, and we find not so promising tweets and responses, not about the very situation, but about the attitude towards Latvian language as the language for society integration as such. Here you see what I am speaking about. And it was, let's say, the main case provoking this uproar in society. A lot of people were considering this bilingual bus disgusting. So you see vaccinacija, COVID, so these are international words, so everybody could understand this. Why bilingual bus? The situation went further. In November, as you know, we celebrate our country's anniversary. And in this heated atmosphere, Riga City Council exposed posters. You see in Russian. In Latvian it sounded very well. Cel Latviju ar darbu, cel Latviju ar valodu. But if you understand Russian, so you see this voзвишай Latviju jazykom sounded quite ridiculous, and again provoked discussions in social networks why it is necessary to poster this content in Russian too. And by the way, there were a lot of discussions about design of these posters. For most of people, they look similar to so-called Georgian ribbons forbidden in Latvia. And by the way, this year, the organizer of this campaign were very careful. They posted only Latvian flag and only some poetry against the white background. And one more fact, very widely reported in social media, it's one of our famous football players. There was a campaign by Ministry of Healthcare in Latvian. Es vakcinēšos, jo gribu satikties ar vecmāmiņu un vectētiņu, so I am going to get vaccinated in order to visit my grandmother and grandfather. And unskillful translator into Russian, let's say, included absolutely different content in this. So if I'm going to be vaccinated, I'll die and I'll meet my grandmother and grandfather. And so it's one of the reasons why maybe we have to be very careful with providing bilingual information. And this, of course, may be even quite funny, but we made serious conclusions out of these facts and campaign. So you see, to our mind, it was simplified understanding of epidemiological situation, and we devaluated the language to communication device. So nobody thought about, let's say, ongoing consequences of this process. Of course, some covert political goals were also implemented using this bilingual information. Some part of population considered that so the dominance of Latvian is over. Now we are returning to what some part of population consider normal situation. Normal, it means social bilingualism. And most of people among Latvian-speaking population too under-evaluated the role of the official state language. And what's the main conclusion? Maybe the very fact was not so negative as all this uproar and narrative around this. One bus in Daugavpils, so very small fact, but the provocation made by this, so it was so ongoing and so intensive that we still feel consequences of this event. The same could be said about this bilingual information in buses and in shops and so on. So very interesting case study. Next week we'll have conference in Liepāja, so I wrote quite a long contribution about this situation, so it will be published in Liepāja proceedings, so you can get also these fragments from social networks and too. And now it's another discussion still going on about Russian language in public space. In Latvia, nowadays, a campaign, De-Russify Latvia, is going on. Mostly in Facebook or in Twitter, group of enthusiasts are demanding to eliminate Russian language web pages, especially from governmental and municipal institutions, to urge Latvian officials speak only Latvian on radio and TV. Quite successful campaign, by the way. So most of municipalities and big enterprises removed the Russian part of their websites. What to say? Of course, it's very nice that NGOs, individuals are promoting strengthening of the Latvian language, but linguists, sociolinguists spoke about this for more than 30 years. We repeated 400 times, state officials, please use only the official state language in mass media. Big enterprises, you are living in country where is one official state language, please use this. And this is a quotation by director of our Latvian language agency that any possibility to use Latvian in which we choose to prepare Russian anyway reduces the use of Latvian, gradually brings Latvian closer to other lesser used disappearing languages. And it's not an exaggeration. So we are following this campaign, how effective it could be. No, as always, there is some counter reaction to this. Especially during elections. We had elections 1 month ago, and when composing new government, which is undergoing process now, but that's true that Latvian is so-called language-centered nation. Language issues are everyday issue on our mass media, and I only would wish more closer cooperation between sociolinguists, language policy makers, and let's say public persons involved in promoting Latvian, because we are doing the same job. And the last aspect about migration and language, also important for all Baltic states and for Europe as such. So until the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Latvia was country with rather low migration. You see figures, so these are approximately 10,000 migrants, mostly from the third countries, and mostly of them have left for Germany, France, and other countries. And you see that only about 200 people were transferred to Latvia under this EU quota scheme some years ago. But now the situation changed quite unexpectedly. Also, we were not very surprised. And our Ukrainian minority, approximately 3% out of total population, had newcomers, approximately 40,000, mostly women and children. And what does it mean from sociolinguistic point of view? First of all, it's taken for granted that Latvia is very supportive for Ukrainian people in all the aspects. So almost each family accommodated Ukrainian families. We donated everything what we can, and indeed we are very empathic, as Lithuanians are. But we have to speak about the linguistic aspect too. So what about linguistic self-sufficiency of Russian language speakers, and which is the language Ukrainians use in communication with Latvians in everyday situation and also in workplace, because most of them are already working. And here you see another aspect. migrants from Russia. We have closed this scheme, getting permanent residence permits when you have investments in Latvia. But anyway, so influx of people from Russia is still quite significant. What about consequences of this process? Unfortunately, we know what's going in Ukraine and these occupied territories. Ukrainian language ombudsmen regularly publish issues about linguicide in Ukraine. Here you see the fragment from the first issue. Now we have the eighth issue 2 or 3 days ago. And the same model we experienced during Soviet period, very consequent Russification in education, in information, and so on. Therefore, we know, and our Ukrainians are very well aware what's going on in their native country. Our position is that we have to provide the possibilities to learn Latvians for Ukrainians free of charge next to their homes. So indeed, we are very active in that respect, and most of Ukrainians are learning Latvian very well. But from the point of view of Latvian language policy, we have to think about some general aspects, not very typical for the rest of the world. First is that the positions of the Ukrainian language is more visible in the Latvian language market. And a lot of shops and institutions already try to post information in Ukrainian too. But it's reality that most of communication anyway takes part in Russian. And so again, we speak about Russian language self-sufficiency in this situation. And the third, the clashes between language and politics. And unfortunately, there are a lot of hostility against Ukrainian refugees from the side of some Russian-speaking individuals. We have reported about more than 400 cases of verbal and not only verbal attacks. So, and we know that for most of for some of Ukrainians, Russian is a native language. So language is the same, but ideology and political views are completely different. And again, we have developed theories about language and national identity and its real expressions in real life situations. So these are 3 case studies. We are working along. We are trying to position them into the framework of Latvian language policy, and the work is going on. And life is life. We see that new dimensions are coming into consideration, and therefore it would be very necessary to develop comparative research between Latvian and Lithuanian scholars to see the differences in language situation and especially in language attitudes, and we all would benefit from this. We'll have to find the proportions between, let's say, general and individual. We have to accommodate our practical language policy to our everyday needs, and last but not least, it would help to develop global meta theory for language contacts and language maintenance. As for language maintenance, it's impossible to answer yes and no to the question, is Latvian endangered language? Yes and no. And we see positive factors, sufficient number of language speakers, legal status of language, theoretically used in all sociolinguistic functions, Also banking field, popular music, communication habits between young people, language in higher education and research seems to be problematic. And we have language policy programs and, of course, not sufficient, but some financing for language policy. But as concerns these negative factors, first of all, again, this linguistic self-sufficiency. In everyday language, it means so there is no necessity to learn and to speak Latvian if you want to function, not occupying, let's say, positions in services or municipalities or governmental institutions. High economic value of the main languages in competition, and last but not least, adverse linguistic attitudes among Latvians and minorities. And summing up. Why we do this research? Most people consider that it's simply scholarly interest, that we have to know what's going on, it's theory. No, it has more practical goal, to update the official language policy guidelines and to learn from the project, the Latvian language, how to cooperate between scholars and national language policy makers in situation which is subjected to unexpected everyday changes, as in the case of COVID, migration, and the Russification campaign due to war in Ukraine. And the work continues. And thank you very much.
Ačiū už pranešimą. Noriu padėkoti Inai už tai, kad atvažiavo į Šiaulius ir dalyvavo mūsų mokslinėme-metodologinėme seminare. Ir manau, kad buvo naudinga lietuviams išgirsti apie situaciją Latvijoje, nes ne taip jau dažnai apie tai taip išsamei yra galimybė sužinoti. Tai ačiū.